Hello, vet welters, and welcome back. With us, we have Dr. David Tabrett. David, you have been in my targets for a long, long time. I don't know if you recall. Before the vet welt was the vet welt.
Yes.
When the idea was I was going to do a book of some sort where we interview, where I was going to send questionnaires to experienced vets to ask about how they make vet life work for them. And then it was Gerardo came up with the idea of maybe we should do a podcast with it. But before that, I actually contacted you and said, because I made a list of about 10 vets in Australia that I thought these look like vets who haven't figured out. And you were on that initial list. And I actually never got around to, either I'd never got around to sending you a questionnaire or I sent it and I figured out that you send people an email and they don't reply. But you chat to them on the phone and they're happy to chat to you for 2 hours. Which is a lesson actually for everybody out there. It's just genuine. It's one thing I've learned. Emails get ignored, phone calls or Zoom calls do not get ignored. People love chat, they just don't like typing.
I 100% agree there.
So anyways, Gerardo, you don't know why I actually contacted David in the last couple of weeks, and for our listeners as well.
To get on the podcast? Is that why you contacted him?
Yeah. But why? Why did David move back up to the top of the list of a must speak to?
Because he's a handsome man. That's why.
This is podcast, isn't
it? So I've been thinking. I'm always thinking about.
Yeah, you always think, mate.
Vet careers and vet life, and why some people love it and some people don't, and what makes the difference. I've got this theory that I'll put out there and I'll see how you respond to it, David and Gerardo and the rest of the country, but not the country, that our listeners. But I have this theory that, and this comes from a talk. I listened to this talk by Jim Carrey the other day, a speech. I mentioned it the other day. And he ends, it's a really fantastic speech. It's, when they talk at universities, the commencement speeches.
Yeah.
Fantastic commencement speech. Typical Jim Carrey, full of humor and jokes and stuff, but he's joking. You don't actually realize he's being deadly serious. And he ends his speech by saying, in the end, you have two choices, love or fear. And love is always the right answer.
So clarifying, love and beer or love and fear? Which one did you say, mate?
Love and beer, it falls under the same banner.
Yeah, love of beer.
So I've been thinking about that a lot in life in general, but and then specifically in vet as well, which made me think, what do we fear? What are the things we fear in veterinary science that potentially ruins our perception of working as a vet? And I started making this list in my head, and from listening to other people and seeing chat on the social media and stuff, I think one of the big fears is the fear of repercussions, the fear of stuffing up, the fear of the official complaint, of a board complaint, or getting into trouble of some sort. It makes you practice in a defensive way. It takes the enjoyment, or I think it'll take the enjoyment out of work to a large degree if you're constantly worried about. Of course, you have to consider it, but if that's your primary concern, is what's going to happen if I stuff up. And then I put a post on social media that I had a heap of response. I asked who has actually had an official board complaint against them, and it was an overwhelming reply, and a lot of scary stuff. Really, lots of people have had horrible experiences with board complaints, or at least really stressful experiences. And then David answered on there, Gerardo, and he said he's practiced or him himself in a long career. In an emergency, I think it's almost inevitable. But you've had quite a few run-ins with the board, Dave, or official complaints made against. I don't know, is it you or the practice, or what's the?
It's not painting a great picture for Dave here.
I think you've laid out that kind of framing of love and fear and what are the two drivers. And so in the context of that post that you put up about board complaints, so my response was, I've been a vet for 32 years. I've had 6 board complaints. I've been an ER vet 17 of those 32 years, 6 board complaints in the 17 years. So it's a higher risk area. I think that was kind of my point. But that doesn't mean that, coming back to one of the things you mentioned just before, that if you start to practice with that kind of one eye looking back over your shoulder, it can actually take away a lot of the personal satisfaction. But I think it also impacts on things like decision making and your ability to diagnose, and really, being there and present for the client. So that's not to say, as you mentioned, that's not to say that we shouldn't be considerate of our responsibilities in this context, but can we help people get to a better way to think about these things so that it isn't necessarily defensive medicine, it's just medicine, and we're professional at the same time.
I like what you're saying there, what you said with professional, because I was taken to the board, and what I was taken to the board for revolved around discrepancies in the conversation that was had.
The ketamine balance in the book didn't balance out on your shift.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was like super spaced out for my shifts, and someone went and checked the special K.
That's not the board. That's another government.
It was a super stressful experience because I was never taken to the board. For the first time I was taken to the board, and then my mentors Simon and Rob. Simon has been to the board, and he said that. It's a conversation depending on the allegations, but it's quite often, it's more of a conversation than it is like kind of like a rap on the wrists or rap over the knuckles, depending on what happens. But my experience was that I stressed out a lot more than I thought I should have. And it was a fair discussion around what happened. And the outcome was that I needed to have a clearer conversation and get clarity, like make sure that the client understood what was going on, and not necessarily change the way they practice, but make sure that the client understands. So now I spend more time being a bit more professional and making sure that that we're on the same page. So developing partnerships with clients, same paging, and asking what their interpretation of what happened, what's going on, and their recollection, and then making sure everything's in alignment.
And Gerardo, what was the thing that you thought was happening before with those conversations? Where was your mind in saying that you actually changed? You changed the way you thought about it. So I'm just wondering, because I think that a lot of the time what happens is, and this is my personal experience as well, is that you're in front of the client and you go, oh, I don't like to talk about either, the bad stuff, the money, the prognostic part, whatever it is. So I'll just get through that. I'll just get through it. And then you realize you're actually doing the client a disservice, and it shouldn't, your discomfort really shouldn't be prioritized over the client and what they need. What was going on for you in the start with that?
So one thing I was doing, I was offering her false peace of mind. So she was concerned and I was concerned, but then she elected not to do diagnostics. But then what happened then was I didn't then go back over and clarify the reasons why I needed to do those diagnostics to determine what's going on and the implications of that. Not trying to dig it in, but just going okay, so if we do miss out on if you do decide not to do these diagnostics, I won't be able to determine 1, 2, 3. But going back and clarifying the reasons why I recommended the plan in the first place, as opposed to what I did was back down and then change the plan completely. And then just started to go, okay, well, him best, and if you want to take him home, that's all cool. So, and I kind of just wrapped up the conversation because I didn't want to, as you said, go into the uncomfortable zone where I would then kind of reiterate the conversation, and that would be uncomfortable in a way for her, because in a way uncomfortable for me because it's kind of digging in. I'm not trying to dig in, it's just trying to get clarity. And then, so since then, part of my de-escalation process is an explanation why I recommended that thing in the first place, so we're clear. And then, so, and
Oh, sorry, you can finish.
And the last thing I do is we always write discharge notes as part of our process. We type a little summary and send the client home with a typed up summary. And in there, I'll just say it. I'll say recommended that, so I'll recall it clearly in the conversation. Like I'll say and reiterate clearly in the consult, but then I'll also put in a discharge notes, but in a non-aggressive manner, just matter of factly. Discuss with the owners that X-ray required to determine whether or not there are foreign bodies present. Owners elected to take Fluffy home and to monitor overnight, and we'll go back to his primary vet in the morning for repeat diagnostics. And that's it. And I actually read it out to them, and I've never used a treatment waiver for the last 3 to 4 years now, ever doing that, since doing that.
What, those against veterinary advice forms? You know?
Yeah. And I find as a managing vet who tackles complaints, quite often it's the treatment waivers which trigger complaints in my mind.
Yeah, it's very confrontational, isn't it?
That's interesting. That's interesting. Because obviously that probably comes back to what Hubert was saying earlier, that, we could end up in a place where we, in that scenario, you're saying the structures and the processes are set up to basically be defensive, to protect. And that's kind of that fear mentality, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting, Gerardo. I want to dig into that discomfort, or David, either one of you, that we have about talking about certain things, where that comes from. Now, I'm of the opinion that Gerardo, you always say that in terms of personality types, the social styles, that something like 70 or 80% of vets are the amiables, where one of our key things is we don't like confrontation. We like people to like us. So you don't want to talk about, Fluffy's going to die if we don't do this, or it's exactly those uncomfortable things. It's interesting that you did the same, Gerardo, because I know that you're a driver. It's not in your nature to do things just to please others. Where did that come from for you, do you think, or have you changed, or why do you think we avoid those things?
I don't know if you want me to speak first, but I'd be interested to hear what Dave says. But then I have something that we could discuss around conflict and perception of conflict, which changed my mind, which helped me. But Dave, what's your thoughts first, mate?
I think that particularly, money is a big driver of complaints and where this goes. And money is a very interesting thing. It has very strong cultural themes and meaning. It has families. And so if you think about how someone is brought up and their relationship with money in their household and how their parents related to money, and from the point of view of personality and things like that, that really, the research is pretty strong, is that our personalities are pretty well formed by 18, 20, around about that age. So that's a bit hard to change some of those things. If someone's had a lifetime, and then you come back to the conflict thing, which Gerardo can talk to, is if my strategy for these things is just to not deal with it, to run away, I can put this off for a long, long time. And so it's often perhaps maybe some of these moments that we're talking about, these experiences where we go, gee, I need to sit in a consult room and get clarity with the client, even though it's feeling uncomfortable. But I might need some help to, learn the skills, to get the scripts, to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's kind of the thing where I see a lot of people, rather than just try and tackle it on your own, because you're always going to stumble with those conversations, because the client they're not part of your little, almost like a simulated role play. They're actually, you can do that training with your team, but the problem is that the very next shift that you do, you might get hit with that conversation, and it gets very real very fast. And you think, hang on, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to respond by saying this. And it can, if you don't have that support with coaching and things like that, I think if you're trying to change these habits, and we talk about them as red frames and green frames, so it could be just anything to do with money becomes a red frame. How can I change that? And the frames are handed to us by our parents, as I said, but also So you walk into a consult room and the nurse has gone, oh, that client, they were really bitchy about spending money. So what am I going to do? I go in and I'm thinking, we're going to have a problem. Well, guess what? We end up with a problem. So I have to hold those frames separate to what my experience is. And just to really, I think it comes back to that thing we said before, just understand clarity, autonomy for the client, and being comfortable in yourself that you've done the best thing for the pet.
Yeah.
It's so useful, David. So where do you go to practice those things? This is going to turn into a personal therapy session really, really quickly, because that is.
Do you need some therapy, Hubert? Is that
the money thing?
Is that what you're doing?
The money thing and the red frame thing. It hits home for me, and it's exactly as you say. This comes from my parents. It comes from my culture. The culture in South Africa is much more spendthrift. And even at our university, our vet faculty was in quite a socioeconomically poor area, and they literally trained us to see where we can save money for the clients.
Yeah.
That's literally how we were trained at uni. So it's a huge thing for me. And despite the fact that I cerebrally understand all of this, I mean, I've run a business, I understand the finances, I'm very good at, I can make an estimate and I don't feel guilty about it. When it comes to opening my mouth and saying that number, my heart starts racing. I get sweaty palms, and this is 20 years into it. So how do you fix that? Where do you go to a hypnosis, or should I get drunk before work? Or
none of those things. Well, that's really in Gerardo's ballpark, I think, that kind of stuff.
I have some things to say about it, because we did a consultation workshop, and Shibli.
Can I just throw in there, Gerardo? We do consultation workshops with our team as well. So
there you go, mate. Good job. We should compare notes. But the money conversation is one of the biggest things. But Dave said something before, which is really important, was that you're going to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And it's stepping into, we talk about fear and not wanting to feel uncomfortable. And that's the very thing that's going to hold you back if you don't. So the zone of potential where you build confidence and where you build like competence and get better and more skilled is actually where you feel uncomfortable. So the feeling of uncomfortable is actually where you're going to grow more. It's actually where you need to be. So, and the conversations I have with veterinarians who start to plateau is because they seek comfort. I want to feel confident. I don't want to fear going to work because I don't know what's going on. So I want to feel confident. So they aim for comfort. And then what happens then is they stagnate. And then they just, don't do the things that they fear, and they get more scared about them. But the money conversation, I definitely had difficulties with money conversations. Like the way that money was discussed when I grew up, we didn't have very much money. So it was something that was scarce and needed to be allocated appropriately and conservatively as well. So whenever having a discussion on money and saying the estimate, it wasn't until my personal coach, Anthony, he does body language, and he's a body language expert, mind reader. And he watched consults from our hospital, and he goes, you know what you guys do? When you have at the most important stage of the conversation, where you need to be certain, where you need to be speaking with clarity and have like proper body language and connection, you're not. Because what you're doing is you're going, the bill is going to be, the bill is going to be $1,500 to $2,000.
Yeah.
And then you look down at the ground, or you don't even look at them. You're patting the dog. The bill is going to be $500.
Like the dog's going to pay.
The dog. You're looking at the dog, right? It's all this kind of like, so you don't want to feel uncomfortable and you don't want to feel bad. So your body language is all like this, that, sorry, it's expensive and everything like that, as opposed to, hey, this is worth it and this is what we need to do. So the lack of certainty and conviction in the voice is the biggest thing, which I believe, which impacts the uptake of the client of your plan. And then ever since highlighting that, and what he did say is that you got to, it's pretty simple stuff. Look straight at the client and just talk to them, right? And say it, but don't fidget. Like, just be really mindful for this 10-second section. It's complete certainty and connection. And then just talk it and then shut up. Like, say it and then don't say anything else. Up, zoop,
silence. Yeah.
So it's like in my head, I'm like, okay. So for us to do 1, 2, 3. So for us to do, I'll frame it. I'll say how I kind of say it. So given that the things that we found today in the examination and history and the concerns that you have, and the concerns that I have, and the diagnostic testing that we need to do today to try to rule out these things or to determine whether or not, Fluffy has these things, combined with the stabilization and management of his current condition, you're looking at somewhere between $1,000 to $2,000. And then I just kind of just stop and then just look. And what I used to think that it's all in their heads, it was all about how expensive that is. Yeah. Then what I was adding meaning into their silence. And what I've learned over years is like, they could be thinking, well,
which card?
Which card to put it on?
Yeah, which one do I get the most frequent flyer points on?
It's right.
And then you interrupt them and go, oh, we could give you a discount.
Yeah, or we could or we could take off the X-ray and the blood test. And
I know. Just be quiet.
Be quiet, and then let them, and then be inquisitive and curious. So stepping into, so now it's a game for me. It's a game. And
can I suggest one of the things, the strategies, because you saying it's a game, that actually goes well to what one of the things I do is I consider these experiments. Okay, so for the next 3 months, this is how I'm going to present an estimate. See how it goes. And then the next 3 months, I might change it differently. And when I say change it differently, I mean, I tell them the total price first, or I tell them the total price last, whatever. Like, it's just little things. Now, to be fair to my hospital, our vets do not present estimates now because our nurses are much better at doing it than what we are. Because somehow nurses, they understand what it costs to run the hospital, and vets are a bit oblivious to that. So I would encourage that.
Yeah.
There was this, yes.
Yeah, I did that in our practice for my own sake. I would say to people, here's my plan. This is what we want to do. I'm going to go do up a treatment plan for you, and it'll come at the front reception. They're going to run you through the cost. If there's any issues with that, come back and chat to me, and we'll talk about options. And that worked really well for me. Now I'm back in the situation of having to say the words again, and I start mumbling and speaking faster. Sorry, I interrupted you, David.
You've got to get your scripts right in your head, I think. There was a story I had, and by story I mean a true event. This is many, many years ago. This is like, I graduated a long time ago, and this was a practice I worked in, a very good practice. It was mostly exotics. So I once was able to look after birds. I was quite competent. I know Gerardo's surprised about this, but I'll never forget this story. So the timing of it makes sense too when you hear what I'm about to say. So I'm saying 20 years ago, and I had this pet galah this client had that had lipomas, and our strategy was we would put them on a diet for 3 months, get them back, make sure they didn't have a coagulopathy because they all had liver disease, and then we would probably do some excision surgery. And so I did that, get this bird back, and it was an older lady, probably, driving an older car, and I gave her the estimate, and I did exactly what you were saying the first time, Gerardo. I was like, oh, it could be this $1,500 or, $1,200. And that included, 20 years ago on a galah, $1,200. And I'm like,
wow, 20 years ago again. Yeah, wow, that's huge. Yeah.
And you know what she said to me? She said, oh, that's fine. My husband said he wouldn't spend over $1,500 on it because after all, it's just a galah.
Yeah.
I went, okay, now I need to reframe my whole world that people want you to look after their pet. So do it.
Yeah, 100%.
The other thing that often comes up is, let's say if they do have the shock, the look on their face, like, oh my God, you just slapped me with a stinky wet fish or something like that. And they're like, what? Or they're like, oh, really? Like, what? You know, oh, this is ridiculous.
See, those are the ones that get me. And even though it only happens a few times a year, that's that my mammalian brains of the reptilian brain that gets that emotional response and goes, oh, I didn't like that. I'm going to do everything I can in future to avoid this response.
Yeah.
So quite often we perceive that as conflict. So the other thing we fear, right? And the reason why we don't have more open the reason why I didn't have more open conversations with clients about, the reasons why I recommended things and so forth, or stood up for the plan that I recommended, was to try to avoid conflict, just the fear of conflict. And then one thing that really resonated for me was that like conflict occurs every day. We don't even realize we're having conflict, but it's our perception of conflict, which is the most important thing. So we may perceive a client saying no to in a consult room as conflict, but then someone else might perceive that as, oh, they're just actually asking a question and we're going to work out something. Yeah. So it's perception of conflict, which is the most important thing, because once we change our perception and, like, first of all, step away from the attaching the no to you as a vet, your skills as a vet, or whatever it may be. So separating you from the conflict, right? And then not labeling the person in your head, oh, you're just like that, right? So once you clear your mind of that, you can then explore what the conflict is and where it comes from. And it's a much more peaceful place to be. It's made my life working as an emergency vet delivering estimates. I delivered an estimate which was $8,000 to $12,000 in the weekend. And I said that with like complete certainty. And she was like, okay, let's go ahead. Right. And it was not where in the past I would have said, well, look, I'm going to tell you an estimate. It's pretty big. Right. And it's somewhere between eight to 12,000. So there's a difference in perception of how I deliver things, but also the perception of the rebuttal, the refute, like whatever, like the feedback you get. Like just try not labeling it and being more curious as to where it comes from and how to solve it and get through it has been a much peaceful process for me.
Okay. So money's it is one of the big complaints thing, isn't it? I for a long time, I thought that was the heart of most of the complaints came from people who felt that they wanted their money back, but it's not always the case. David, what are other, well, you obviously as the practice owner would deal with the complaints just like Gerardo. Where do complaints come from, or what if you could list the top hits of client complaints?
Well, again, I want to be fair to my colleagues at ARAC and work. I don't deal with so many these days, but as a hospital superintendent, I certainly take an interest in how we manage these. So in terms of like, where do they come from? It's interesting how you said there's a perception that money is the driver of complaints. And I agree. I think that's a furphy. The number one thing is communication. And number 2 and 3. Because ultimately, when we sit down and we're in a consult room and a client has an expectation, we have to seek that clarity that Gerardo was talking about. If we can actually conduct the conversation to address whatever the financial concern is, then it's the conversation that might fall over, because the work can cost what it costs. So if the client agrees to it and we've had a clarity around that process, then it always comes back to communication. It's very few instances where I think there's things like medical mishaps, and there are things like drug errors and so on. But by and large, and to be honest, things like drug errors come down to hospital communication, don't they? How we work with our team. So I think you would go a long way to search through most, if you had access to, a broader picture of complaints, not just your own, then you would go a long way before you find something where communication wasn't the key driver.
They'll always. So
yeah,
you go, Dave. Keep going.
Oh, I think Gerardo mentioned very clearly early on. The written communication is vital. It's not an either or. You don't get to just have a verbal conversation with a client and then go, I've told them, everybody agrees. If you didn't write it down, then it didn't happen. So you've got to be careful.
That's exactly the reason why I went to the board, because I didn't communicate at that stage. I communicated it, but I didn't write it in the discharge notes. And I didn't write it in the history because I didn't want because we used to send the history with the client. So I didn't want the history to sound confrontational and have conflict with her. So the history that she had, and essentially I went to the board and I accepted that I didn't communicate properly. So, but I agree with Dave that communication, especially when it comes to complaints, communication is quite often the underlying cause, but in various forms. It could be not communicating clearly. It could be not communicating like finances appropriately and being clear. It may be not listening. Like listening is a part of communication. Like the vet didn't listen. Like
so many of the complaints I dealt with when I ran the hospital was start with, I felt like they weren't even listening to me, or I felt like the vet didn't care. And I think that comes back to that listening.
And but then they'll come and ask for money, right? They'll ask for money back because they feel like they didn't get the service or didn't get value for what they paid for. But the vast majority of times, the underlying cause is communication. Yeah, 100%.
David, you said written communication is vital. What does that look like for you? Do you guys do discharge notes like that as well, or you do?
Yeah. I think one of the things about working in emergency is it teaches you how to write detailed medical records. And I've always coaching, our interns and our junior vets is how to actually make sure you capture things like the conversations. It could be the phone conversations. And they're like, oh, do I have to write down every word? And I'm like, no, but I want you to make sure that you capture what the client's concerns were when they rang up at 2 a.m. and, what you said to them. It just needs to be recorded. Having been involved in some complaints, as I said, that go through to the board. I mean, if it's not in the medical record, and I've been on the other side as an expert witness for the board as well, and if it's not in the medical record, then what do you've got to have it there. So luckily these days, I mean, when I graduated, you young'uns don't get this, but when I graduated, we had 5x7 cards that we wrote with pen.
I've never worked with cards. Hubert,
Hubert, you're come on. What have you been having, Botox? You're not that old.
It's probably possibly more of a reflection of my first job of the clinic.
Yeah, so fair enough.
Big metal cupboard, we draw it out and you go ABCD. Oh, there we go.
But that's right. But we used to have stamps, that so you could do your physical exam on the card. Well, these days we have templates.
Yeah.
But try and make sure you fill in the templates. And the good thing about that is not only does the template help you then create the record, but I actually find it can actually prompt me with some difficult cases, because we've got differential lists in our medical record templates. So it could actually help me in the work as well.
But do you send, Gerardo says they do discharge sheets. Do you guys send written stuff home with your owners as well? Or is this just your own medical records?
Yeah. I mean, we've got a nice glossy folder and stuff. And I always say, I don't want the client to work out that the only bit of paper they walk out of the clinic with is an FPOS receipt. I want them to have something that's evidence, because you know what, most people when they come in, there's someone else at home who goes, what happened at the vets? What, you spent $600 and you got a packet of tablets? Yeah, I think they did some blood tests or something. Well, so if you've actually got some record that the client can actually use, because they talk to friends, whatever, they get on social media, which could be saying, hey, my vet's fantastic, mind you, too. So it's not necessarily bad when they talk on social media. But yeah, we do want to make sure the client walks out with something that's more than just a receipt.
Is that even for just the consult? Because where I work now, it's for the hospital cases, they do it.
Yeah.
But it's really, if you're doing it for every consult, it does take time. And how do you do it for every single consult?
I will myself. I'm a fast typer and I know how to use the templates fast, but I realize that not everybody. And I think one of the things is that with experience, your ability to cognitively process the information and get to a point can happen a lot faster. And so I know that, and that could actually be a negative too, mind you. But I do know that, some of the less experienced people, I've been an emergency vet for 17 years. So, but some of our less experienced vets probably need to sit with it. So they're not going to get the information out and a summary and whatever done as quickly. But nevertheless, we would email that record. It might be done half an hour later or an hour later.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. That's really interesting.
Yeah, we do. Well, at least personally, all our hospital. I know that some of our hospitals don't do discharge notes, but it's a short summary of what was said and just the key points really, and then the meds and then the plan kind of thing. But we have templates for the discharge notes for really common things that occur commonly.
Yes.
So
Yes.
if you invested like we invested the time to create these templates, you can just adjust them slightly and you can almost cut and paste them like we cut and paste in.
Yeah. The number one problem that you see in ER practice is a vomiting dog. And all the outpatient vomiting dogs, which is, 80% of them, you're going to talk to them about bland diet. So there's a template. You've just saved yourself heaps. Think of how many animals that is over the course of a year. And if you had to type that up every time, you use the technology. Otherwise, I've got an old card system to sell you.
You don't want to see my handwriting. That's
No.
When you talked about communication, one of the words I heard you say was expectation. I find that's huge as well. A lot of complaints I've dealt with was where the expectations weren't made clear. So the animal went home and didn't get better, but the owners had no idea what does better look like, what does worse look like, when should I worry? And then it goes to shit and they go to your competitor and instead of coming back to you because it's not fixed. And then things go pear-shaped. And then the competitor fixes it and then you did because, well, he could do it and you couldn't fix it, even if it was going to get better anyway. So I find that's something that saved me personally. I think a lot of headaches is I wrap up every transaction with, I expect this. I want them to be better within 12 to 24 hours. I want it to be back to normal in 3 days. If X, Y, Z happens, come back to me straight away. And probably I'm not writing that down, but that's probably not a bad idea to write that down again. And then I have a sentence that I think really, really helps. I've found that I've had almost no comebacks. I will say to people, if I'm wrong, this and this and this will happen. I think mentally that opens the door to the client that, you know what, it's not always cut and dry. He's not fixing my lawnmower. Things, he can be wrong. Like he can misdiagnose things or miss things. I say if I've missed something or if I'm wrong, then this and this is going to happen. And then please come back so we can fix it. And then they come back if it doesn't work. I really like that one. That's my little ninja trick.
I remember years and years ago when I first started my emergency clinic, and I used to, on a Thursday morning, I used to go up to the John Hunter Hospital here in Newcastle, and I had a contact who was an emergency department registrar. And so I was able to get an invite to their resident rounds on a Thursday morning, which was great, just to learn their thinking and everything. And I always remember that one of the things they talked about was the consultant saying, that it's better to get to what's called an open diagnosis rather than to make some, put all your eggs in one basket. Keep these options open and set up that schedule for, if this doesn't happen in this time, come back or go see your GP. So I kind of took a lot of lessons from that in the human field, they're going, as I used to say to people, look, they've got the biggest MRI in the state. They've got a 24-hour lab. They've got an ICU. They've got a hospital full of doctors. And they're talking about, listen, we might have an open diagnosis. And I think one of the stresses that comes up for a lot of people is, we've talked about money. Another one is this expectation and the difference that people see between, the expectation on the vet, the expectation on the human medico. And look, to me, I don't know what all the explanation for that is. I just know it is what it is. And so the more that we can have that clarity, then I think we're going to go a lot further to managing that expectations for clients.
I love everything you guys said there. And when I think about it, that's kind of what we have at the bottom of our discharge summary is, if your pet doesn't improve, it's like a template. If your pet doesn't improve, becomes flat lethargic, goes off their food and water, develops vomiting and diarrhea, or please contact your primary vet or the animal emergency service immediately.
Yeah.
And then I actually read that out to them as part of when I because I read out the discharge summary to make sure they're on the same page. And then that one sentence has helped in terms of managing client complaints, because they said, oh, well, the dog didn't get better. But it's like, well, in the discharge summary at the bottom, it says, if this doesn't happen, like, if there's any deterioration, there's vomiting diarrhea, then you need to bring them back or go back to the primary vet. And they're like, oh, okay. And it's kind of like, so a discussion was had. So I find that helps out quite a lot.
Okay. Now, that was all really, really useful. But I wanted to talk about, but I definitely want to touch on what happens when you have an official complaint, because I think a lot of us have this fear of, when you get an official complaint, a board complaint against you, that you're really in the shit and it's going to be a horrible process. And I'm not sure what exactly people feel about this, but I'd love, and I've never gone through it personally, but I'd love to hear from your perspective, Dave, what happens in that process practically. What does it look like? And then also what happens emotionally. And I'm sure it's different the first time versus when it's happened, when you've gone
versus the sixth.
The sixth time. But and how do you deal with it? Because I'm sure there must be feelings of, am I shit? Did I stuff up? Am I good enough?
Yeah.
It's all this stuff that you have to deal with in your head. Talk us through how it transpired for you.
There's so much, isn't there? There's a couple of things. So first of all, we've just talked a bit about the communication and clarity. So I think if you actually get to a board complaint, then we probably have mishandled other elements of the complaint process. Having said that, I know that there's a lot of people who take me to task. There are some clients who are hell-bent on having their day in court. Sure, they exist. I've had plenty of those. I'd much rather go to the vet board than the Department of Fair Trading, mainly because Department of Fair Trading, I'm actually going to have to sit in the room with the client, which means we're going to revisit all of the issues, and now it's compounded. And at the end of the day, it's just going to involve some exchange of money and we walk away. So I'd rather go to the vet board. The other thing is that with the vet board is, where else does the client go if they feel they have a legitimate complaint? Because there are plenty of clients who feel their complaint, notwithstanding what I said, that some people, malicious or vindictive, mendacious, but there are some clients, and a lot of them, who actually feel having this complaint is the right thing to do. So I think we have to recognize that that's important, that this process exists. And it is one of the things I always say to people, you sign your stat every year saying you're going to register as a vet, which means you accept the code of conduct and the regulations. And part of that is there is a review and a complaint process. Now, having said all that, what were my feelings? Terrible. The first time I thought, it was actually very early on in my ER career, in a very busy hospital in Sydney. I was on my own with like 30 or 40 patients, I can't remember, and it was a little pug that was had bronchiectasis and collapsing trachea, very progressive, rapidly progressive. And I was an experienced vet at that stage, so it was scary. And unfortunately, the little one died, and the client then made a complaint. But I did get good support in the follow-up from my supervisor and my boss, and they taught me a few things which I've used right through to this day. A couple of things is, don't hide from this process. Whatever you do, do not just get on the front foot and engage with it. And one of the things that we do is, as soon as we know this is happening, and you usually have an idea that a complaint might be coming, we will start to seek people's input. Like, we want everybody who put a hand on this patient, even if they're not going to be named in the complaint, we want their version of events and their activity. And we want the record to look, we're not adjusting the medical record. I want us to create a new record of events, a timeline, and so on. And my goal is to make sure that we give the board as much information as we can up front. I want them to look at our submission and go, oh, these guys have thought of everything, right? So that's why I think one of the things we mentioned previously, Hubert, was I said, I'm not arrogant about it, but I'm not reserved about a board complaint coming in now, because the thing is, we want to give the client that opportunity. And so that's legitimate, and we'll debrief and look at our processes. But two, I think we could actually write and look at what we've done and say, you know what, despite everything, we did a good job. Then there's always going to be an adverse outcome. Nobody ever complains when, their dog got better, survived, and they were happy to pay the bill. Although we did have a client recently who threatened to complain, although he told us that we did a great job. So I always wonder what's going
in the same sentence. In the same sentence that he did.
Literally. You guys did a great job. But interestingly, that client actually said, I just wish the communication had been as good as the clinical care.
Yeah.
Now, I've got issues about, and we got different versions of that. So, yeah, it was terrifying, but the first time I was working in a supportive clinic, and they helped me craft a response. Because one of the things that's really important about this is, and Gerardi, you know this, and same Hubert, when you were in Perth, as a superintendent or in a, ER practice, there's often a number of practitioners who have a hand in the care of the pet, but there's usually only one vet who gets a complaint. So
one person gets pulled along the coals.
one person. And the funny, I remember one we had, I think we had 6 vets write a part of this, response, because they all had some involvement in the case. But only one person gets the complaint. So, and I think that's a problem with the process, because it really localizes. It's a part of the legislation. It localizes, I'm talking New South Wales mainly here, but it localizes the problem in the person and not in the systems. And so when we look at error management and error investigation, a systems approach is far more helpful. A lot of industries have moved away from localizing the problem in the person, because, to be honest, who amongst us got out of bed this morning, went to work and said, geez, I hope I kill a patient. Geez, I hope I, peeve off one of the clients. We don't. We go there to do our best effort. And sometimes things, maybe we got stuck in traffic. Maybe we've got a grumbly tummy. Maybe we're worried about our water heater burst and we've got a plumber coming, and we all know how much plumbers charge. Maybe all of these things. And then the client comes in and we're just not on our game. But for that client, it's the worst day for their pet. And if we're not on our game, maybe we get a complaint. And unfortunately, none of those.
And like you say, or you have 30 patients in hospital and you
Right.
just don't have the time to do the job you want to do.
Yeah, and none of those things really come. Like I was thinking about this in preparation for talking. I've been doing a bit of work in study in error management, and I was thinking, yeah, those things are all true about the systems and so on, but I've never written a response to the vet board saying from a systems perspective. It's always been written from, here's what I did, here's what I was thinking, here's what happened. But I'm not saying, oh, I got out of bed that morning, I hadn't had enough sleep, or the practice software, maybe the computer went down or something for half the day, so we couldn't access the record. I mean, that would probably get included, but you know what I mean? Like, we localize it in ourselves. And this comes back to one of the things you mentioned about, how do you question yourself in imposter syndrome? When you start really, despite the fact that you're a qualified vet, and you see 5,000 patients a year and you have one that ends up in front of the board, you start thinking you're the worst person on the earth.
That's the spiral and the labeling in your head that one complaint, that one board thing is
identifies you.
It proves
identifies
I would expect it that I'm a shit vet. Yeah,
I'm a shit vet. I shouldn't be a vet. And the first thing I say to them, how many pets have you treated over the last 6 months? And they'd be like, maybe about 700. Okay. Yes. And then, and this is the first complaint. It's like 0.0 something, 0.01 or whatever it is. Like, stop it. Like, almost like verbally slap them out of it and go, like, I don't want to hear any of that stuff ever again, because you've demonstrated that you could do your job, demonstrated time and time again, but this is the situation we're dealing with now. Don't make it mean like you're a shit vet.
There's a part of imposter phenomenon, which is workplace support, perceived workplace support actually mitigates against the degree of imposter syndrome and reduces emotional exhaustion. So in organizations that have low perceived organizational support, if you feel like imposter phenomenon is occurring, what happens is that you actually start to call upon greater resources in yourself to feel better. And that then affects the rest of your life because you don't have enough resources. So perceived support, and I think that's probably what I was referring to in the first workplace when I had a complaint. My bosses, although they weren't there on the night, I did actually speak to them. But subsequently, when the complaint came in, they gave me good guidance. And so I didn't feel like an imposter. They reinforced, their trust in me. But we did review the processes. And I think that's an important part, to make sure that whatever the complaint points to, it points to something in our process that needs review. Doesn't mean we have to change it.
Mm-hmm. There's one thing that I've found with tackling complaints over the last several years, and that is our perception of what a complaint is.
Mm-hmm.
Quite often, like, the client has questions. Oh, that's a difficult client to complain. Like, sometimes they just have questions, or they want to give some feedback. It's like, not every client's there to ask for money back, or they just want to be heard. You understand. And sometimes, like, depends on the advice that you have, and the legal advice. And people will say you shouldn't say sorry, but you can say sorry that it happened. I'm sorry that you experienced that. And
well, just even something like an empathetic statement is like, I can see how distressing this has been for you. I can hear in your voice that this has really upset you. I understand why you're upset.
And the pressure that we put on ourselves as people who tackle complaints, to feel like as if you need to solve the problem in the first go, the first conversation you have with the client, you need to seek a resolution and solve it. Quite often, what I'll do is I'll listen and I'll go, hey, look, I might need a few days to have a look into things, but I just wanted to touch base and listen to what you had to say and make sure I understood. Is it okay if I check into some things and get back to you in a few days? So that So then what happens is you start to develop a relationship over the discussions, and then the likelihood of that going to a board complaint is so slim, because they feel like as if they've been heard, they feel like to be connected to with, and every time I will always say, okay, this is the actions I'm going to take, and hey, look, I'm going to bring this feedback to the team because we can all learn from this. So there's them putting their hand up and wanting to give a complaint often has good feedback in it and ways we can improve our systems. So complaints are often the ways that we kind of make things better. So
yeah, we took that a step further, and because we use a SharePoint for our intranet, and we have a client feedback log. It used to say client complaints. We changed it. It's client feedback. Now, to be, I'm not naive about this. Not many people write positive feedback into that space, where they put it in a different space, and it's shared widely on our Yammer page. But the client feedback just kind of helps to reframe it a little. And I think you're right. It's interesting. You said something there, Gerardo, that reminded me of what you said about the consult. You set up the expectation of what is going to come next. So when you're talking to the client, you say, I'm going to talk to our team. I'll get back to you in 48 hours. It's kind of like that same thing when you have the patient in there, if he's not better in 48 hours. So you're helping to establish some control. And I think actually asking the client, is this okay? Because then if they agree to it, then they're saying yes to you, and this strengthens your relationship.
Quite often, some of the complaints that I get through can be like written. They're like, oh, this is going to be a tough one. And I find myself getting worked up around it and all that kind of gets straight. And then all of a sudden, like, just stop it, just call the person, pick up the phone, call them. And then like maybe 80% of the times it's not as bad as what you make it out in your head. But if you approach it with a real defensive, aggressive manner, I'm going to protect myself or protect this and all that kind of stuff, then you can flare up a complaint into a board complaint super quick, super easy.
I think the other thing you mentioned too about how clients ring up and you think, oh, they're going to demand money. My perspective on that was, I'll be on the floor and the team of, all they cared about was money, which is kind of ironic given that's often a criticism from the client of us. But to me, it's like, what else is the client going to say? I want you to do a better review of, Nelson and Kudo or Fossum's book. And you go, oh, how'd they know about that? They don't know any of that. All they know is, well, they took some of my money. Maybe I could have some back. Like what? They don't have another mechanism to express their feelings. So in the absence of understanding that and having that conversation, then they are going to end up talking about the money. And true, some of them will, it's just refund me the money. But
yeah. Well, the other avenue is, if it's not money, then I'm going to take it to the board because I want you to be in trouble for what you did or didn't do. Which brings us back to the board, to complaints
Yes.
process.
So I do know some board, and this would be different around the world. And it's good that Dave said that what he's referring to or his experiences with New South Wales, and my experience is only with Queensland. But some states in Australia have much stricter boards and different perspectives on the management, how they tackle it, and the severity of penalties. But yeah, so it's important to factor in where you are in the state and the country you live in and the implications.
I'm actually lining up a couple of people from the boards to come and talk to us on the podcast about their perspective. I've got two.
That's good.
That's good.
Two online.
Send them a copy of. There's a guy in Queensland, Sydney Decker, who's a professor of human factors over at Griffith University. He's written a couple of books about in error management. So there's some good reading there.
Okay.
I'd highly recommend it for people.
Okay, awesome. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So something that I saw on many of those stories about complaints and how horrendously stressful it was, and some people are traumatized by it. Like literally,
Yeah.
got the impression that their careers have been different since then. They used to be happy, carefree vets, and now they cynical, scared, and which is really sad. It makes me it's really a tragedy. But one of the big things was the length of the process. So you get that letter, here's a complaint, and then it stretches out for ages until there's some sort of resolution. And I felt like there was a lot of mental anguish in that waiting period. You know, they more. Did you experience it like that?
I know we had one board complaint where we had to ask for an extension on our end. There was no extension on the client side. They generally write reams of paper fairly quickly. But I do know there was one, and I think it was associated with a staff member, not being off on leave or something. I'm not going to contact a staff member on leave to respond to a complaint.
Yeah.
We did have one that was a bit of a hassle because the staff member had came in months later, and the staff member had left the practice. In fact, they'd left the country, not to get away from us. This was back pre-COVID when you could travel.
Yes.
And we finally tracked them down, and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this." And I do know that it caused a fair degree of distress because it was following them. But as I said right up front, that's just part of the thing that we sign up for as vets. I think that I guess I would come back to that thing. I think New South Wales management of these is pretty good. I don't think they're certainly aware of the trauma of time. And I agree, Hubert. I was disheartened to read some of the stories that just resolving the timeline, like 2 years, is
and a lot of people
crazy.
said they felt really, I don't say victimized, but not supported at all by the board. They were disappointed. There was a lot of disappointment in how they were from the beginning, sort of assumed guilty before proven guilty. And but I don't know. Is that a perception? Because I like what you say, that to go, well, yes, we should welcome the process because it upholds the standard of our profession. And if you end up on the wrong end of that, well, submit yourself to it.
There's very few circumstances. Sorry, I've stepped over you there. There's very few circumstances when you read the board newsletters. I know in New South Wales they map out certainly the more serious stuff when people have been reprimanded, and you kind of think, yeah, this is clear breach of the law. The ones where you go, oh, they've suspended, but there's almost always people are given another chance. And my experience is that the circumstances where we had one that was an adverse outcome and involved a fine, and I thought, on balance, it was probably a reasonable decision. I didn't welcome it by any means, and it certainly affected the staff who were involved. It was sad what happened. So, where we ended up probably was the right place to be, but I wish we actually ended up reviewing our processes quite dramatically as a result of that. So that, maybe that's how it's supposed to work. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose yes, it is there for a reason. It's to uphold the standards. Because as a practitioner who's worked in all sorts of practices in 3 different continents, I listened to your processes and Gerardo, to you guys as well, and how polished it is and how it's almost bulletproof if you follow the system. But I also know that it's not always possible. And that's where I feel like you are opening yourself up to this. You go, well, I'm in this practice where I've got 15-minute consults, or we don't have all these systems and templates, and I am doing my best, and I'm doing it with the best of intentions, but I feel really exposed because there's this, the scepter of lightning's going to come down and strike me if a client takes it, something's going to go wrong, and I don't know how to deal with that. I suppose I'm trying to get to, or was hoping to get to a place to help people. I love that we're talking about how to prevent complaints, but sometimes shit happens and you're going to
Yeah.
get complained. I want to get an idea of that process, and I suppose the repercussions, what happens with it, because I also wonder, and I'm not saying this is the case at all, but whether we exaggerate what's going to happen if you get a complaint. So I get a complaint, and what does that look like? Does it mean I'm going to lose my license? Am I not going to be able to practice? I'm going to pay a fine? You know, how I want to, but with zero experience, I want to say surely, unless I've been malicious about something or trying to cheat somebody or, you know, willful wrongdoing, I'm going to get a warning or get told, well, you should communicate better or review the processes. Is that accurate, or are they real punishment that gets doled out for, let's say, excusable mistakes?
My take is that.
Hang on, I've lost you.
No, you're good.
Sorry.
Good? Yeah. My take and my experience with board complaints, and from what I've heard, if it honestly, like you could have done something better, you could have improved. You know, like if you did something malicious and obvious, and it was, you know, a way of that impacted pets' lives, and it's not a way to practice or something. You know what I mean? Like if it was an obvious and a deliberate thing, then the consequences could be severe, but it is very hard. Like so.
But not just could be, should be.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if someone, you know, do I want to work in a practice alongside someone who, you know, ships off steroids in brown paper bags or things like that? I think we have to call out these things. I'm not saying we have to nominate that, but yeah, you're right. The consequences at that level, absolutely.
Yeah, but the vast majority of times, it's conversations, and it could be fine, or it could be it's conversations and warnings. Hey, next time, what are you going to do next? You know, and so it's what did you? So I think the consequences, if it's an honest mistake, right, are more around awareness, and the consequences are less in terms of, like, we blow them to much bigger proportions than actually what they are. That's my perception of what happens as a result of the vast majority of these. I don't know, Dave, what's your thoughts?
Well, I agree with those things. So with those sentiments, exactly. I think there was something interesting though, Hubert, that you said is like, I've got 15 minutes consults and I've got, you know, less than adequate facilities, or I'm not, the boss has said, don't refer anything out or something like that. And then I'm pushed beyond my skill set, but I haven't communicated properly to the client. These are systems problems, and this is one of the areas where I think we get into real difficulty with the process and to some extent the legislation, because it might be you as the individual who's been complained about, and really what we need is a more expansive view of how this error or adverse outcome occurred. But that's one of the things too, is understanding is that the board isn't actually there to investigate the problem. They're there to investigate the complaint and your response to it. So in often cases, that's why we keep coming back to the communication. You're allowed to sometimes it's not like permission, but if you miss that zebra diagnosis because you thought it was a horse when you heard hoofbeats, you're not going to get hauled over for that. You know, that's not going to happen. I've had the experience of actually going to, with one particular complaint, in New South Wales, they have this kind of back and forth thing. So the client makes a complaint, you respond, the client responds, you respond again. And then if need be, they might actually have a verbal interrogation. I say that because there was me with 6 board members asking me questions. That was terrifying. And I've been, by this stage, you know, a vet for 20 something years. So, and there were things that came up in that I thought, oh, I haven't thought about that, you know. But in the end, it was about process and how our hospital operated. So it was scary, no doubt. But I feel better having gone through it. It's kind of the wrong thing to say though, isn't it? Like, oh, everybody should go through it. I think, Gerardo, you made a point though. How many patients do you treat? It's just not going to be that common. But I reckon we'd all, with the volume of work that we do, we're all likely that it's going to happen to us.
Yeah.
And if you work in ER, it's going to happen more than once.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we might we talked about complaints, like we might get negative feedback. Dave, we did the same thing, changed it from complaints to feedback. Might one a week, or maybe 2 a week, but often like less than 1 a week. And we might see 250 patients or something over that week. Right. So
yeah, we track ours and map it as a percentage, and we're down to 0.3% for feedback.
Yeah, I think ours was like 0.5 or something like that. It was super small,
yes.
and it's kind of like it's going to happen. It happens, and then of those ones, it takes resources and time and stress, and often they can be resolved without going to the board. So, but yeah, there was something I was going to talk about, but I can't remember what it was. There's something you rolled off, Dave. It was really good. If it comes up again, I'll just spruce it again. But the complaint that I had actually was 2.5 years after it happened.
Oh God.
Yeah. So, but I had a recollection of it.
What prompted the client to complain? Do you know?
Time, dwelling. I don't know. No idea. She just had this, but she wrote the letter. But her recollection of it, as Dave said before, reams. They write reams. There was like 12-page submission of her experience and stuff, and I was like, I don't even remember. Like honestly, I don't even like I had an idea, but then I was certain, but then when I think back and like I could just be making that up,
Yeah.
So that's where your records come into play.
Your records are the thing.
So let's start wrapping it up. There's a lot of wisdom there, Dave. I really appreciate your insights in it, and we could do multiple episodes with you because I think you've got a lot more to offer than just complaints. But how do we
negative feedback, mate? It's called feedback. It's called feedback.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, when the board phones me one day, I'll say it's feedback or a complaint.
that's probably a complaint.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So it is a reality, but it's something that can happen, and in a long career, most likely will happen. It's a necessary evil. I'm trying to think, how do we think about this? Live with it without it ruining our careers.
Well, I think what Dave said, one thing, sorry, just come to my bottom mind there, was the culture and the practice around complaint and complaint management and support is a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it a witch hunt or is it a let's find the fact?
And what can we do? Like, how can we improve things? Like, so we're if the culture is, I made a mistake, and all let's hide it, but no, we're not going to hide. Like, so it depends on the culture and acceptance of the mistakes happen. But then obviously conversations around how to stop them from happening is important. But if the culture is open and understanding and supportive and looking towards improving, then the whole complaint process for the team and for the veterinarian can be.
It's all well and good for you as a director who gets to set the culture, the status. But many people are in positions where, they're part of the culture, but they're not there, and it's maybe a less than ideal culture. I've certainly worked in less than ideal culture, but I still had to work there, and I still had to deal with this. So I'm just trying to offer some, I suppose it's not something we can fix, but some sort of insight into how do you keep practicing with heart instead of from a place of fear, knowing that there's this thing that can and possibly will happen if you have a long enough career. How do you practice without it souring it for you? Maybe we've discussed it. I still don't know. I'd love some. I don't know if you have the answers, but what do we say about that?
If it can happen to Gerardo, it can happen to anybody.
Oh, that's hilarious! You're the best, mate.
I think you made a really, really important point there, Hubert. that certainly most people listening in the podcast are not going to be owners or directors. And so they feel like, well, that's the culture of what's going on around here.
Yeah.
They do actually influence that. There's lots of definitions of culture. One that I like is it's the way things happen around here, or it's the conversations that are happening. So, you know, the leader has the biggest influence, no doubt. And if you come back to the things that we've talked about in terms of systems and processes, then they're very much going to be guided by the leader. But it's also possible for people to just say, hey, you know, it's the little things. When you come out with the client, or the client is in the room and then you come out and someone says, oh, they're not going to agree to it. You know, did you see how they walked in? No, that's not on. If I'm on the floor, I don't have to be the boss to put a stop to that language. I can say, hey, they're going through a rough time. Let's worry about the patient.
Yeah.
So you can influence it, and it's like rolling that stone up a hill. It's little bit by little bit. I'm not saying that you're going to fix things, but it's the people who will be working with you. They'll start to like working with you because they're there to care for the patient and for the people. And when they see the vets doing that, caring for the person who brings in the patient, they're going to feel much better about the place, even if you might find the systems don't really help you. And eventually you either buy it or you move along, or it changes with you.
And I believe this is so how do I live with this? How do I live 20 years in practice and a chunk of that in emergency? How do I live with the fear of complaint? I genuinely think what you just said there, Dave, drastically reduces the risk of complaints in the first place. It comes with intentions. I think I've discussed this before in the podcast, but there's a beautiful section in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books where he refers to a chunk of research from human medicine, where they did a research study on human doctors who and they looked at who had official complaints against them and who hasn't in their entire careers. And then they listened to recordings of their consultations. And they tried the first round of research was, what do they say to their clients? Are there anything that they say that is a predictor of how likely it is that they're going to have a complaint, an official complaint against them for the duration of their careers? And there were some things. Then somebody else took those same recordings and they split them into 4-second sound bites. They garbled the words so you couldn't hear the words. And they played those little sound snippets to the study subjects. And they had to try and guess who was going to get complaints against them. And they were ridiculously accurate. Ridiculously accurate. With 4 seconds of tone of voice, normal people, these are not psychologists listening, these are normal people who could listen to that and guess who's going to have complaints against them. And what that means to me and how I look at this is my intentions when I walk into that room. Because what it comes down to is if the client likes you, they're much less likely to complain about it. If they feel that you have their best interests at heart, you have their pet's best interest at heart, and you want to do what's right by them, even when things go wrong, they're much less likely to take it further. They might give you feedback. They might say, hey, David, I'm sad that it happened, but I like you, so I'm not going to take you to task for it. So my approach is I come to work with my best intentions. I want to do what's right for the client. I think they sense that. Of course, I do all those other things. I try and make sure my notes are right and my communications right. But in the end, I do my best, and I have this thing in my head about, and if something ever goes wrong, if I get an official complaint and they kick me off the vet registration board and I can't be a vet anymore, then fuck them. I don't want to be part of this profession anymore. It sounds silly, but I have this thing about I do my best. And I heard a beautiful saying the other day, do what you can with what you have where you are. And that's what you do. You do what you can. And if something happens there, then you deal with it as best as you can. But I'm not going to let it make me bitter and not enjoy my work because I'm scared of this thing that may never happen.
Sounds good.
Wrap it up.
Sounds good.
I remembered what I was going to say, but it may open up a big can of worms. But we talked about supporting like the team members that are going through it, and it's a team approach sort of thing, because the team's often involved in errors. And sometimes it's not even the person who actually did. A nurse may have done something, or like a reception team may have done something, but you're the vet who's in charge of the case, so you get taken, right? But then one thing that I think it's important for us as a profession, like in our entirety as a whole, is support for each other. Because some of the complaints are generated because they might go get a second opinion, and it might be blaringly obvious to you, or to you the second time you've seen it, because the dog is so much more sicker, when the first vet may have missed it. And it's those conversations which are really tricky to navigate, especially if a client is looking for a reason why you stuffed up in the first place, or the first vet stuffed up in the first place, and looking for reasons to go back, so they can try to navigate or twist the conversation into you saying that, look, they should have picked that up. But I think we should all bear in mind that it's our responsibility as veterinary professionals, and for our community of veterinary professionals, that we have to support each other as well. And you got to factor in that you weren't there. You didn't do the exam the first time. You really have no comments, really. And be careful not to throw our colleagues under the bus.
In fact, I'll go the opposite way. And if I think there's any risk of them interpreting what's happening, if I'm the second vet to see it, I will actually say stuff to flip it around for them. I'll say, "Oh, crikey, this was a tricky one. I would have done exactly the same in the first consult because X, Y, and Z. Thanks for bringing it in, but those guys did a great job the first time." That's a curveball that nobody could have expected.
Yeah,
it's a very, very big, very big hindsight bias, and one of the things that is fundamental when we come back to look at error management is, how do you get into the position where I now do not know the outcome when I have to review someone's work? You can't. So you're right. It is a big can of worms. But we can't talk all night, gents. I mean, come on.
So we can leave that for later. But it's just my final thought was just we just got to support each other. Really,
support each other. Yeah.
So it's not covering up, but it's literally like, I like what Hubert said, that I might use it now. It's like, wow, I would have thought the same. Often what I say is, I would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
I would have thought the same thing. Or that's really weird. That's super weird. This is really, really rare, or something. But yeah, so
have we got time for the one message?
Go for it.
David, go without it. David, conference, all the world's first new graduate veterinarians, and they want to know what David has to say. What one word of advice, not 1 word, 1 2-minute bit of advice have you got for them?
Well, if it was all the new grads in the world, I'd say we need a bigger building. I thought about this. Is a really interesting question. Get a mentor. Have a mentor. Could be a formal program. In Australia, the AVA runs a mentoring program. Could be informal. Probably best not someone you work with, but can be. That's not a drama. But I tell you what, there's so much wealth of experience, and anyone listening to you guys know how much older vets like to talk.
I rarely ever speak in these podcasts, I think. That's good.
That's 2 insults.
That's not my experience, but he must edit you out afterwards.
I'm sure he does, especially the bits where I say something profound and it makes him look bad. But what he does is he gets the bits where I stuff up and he puts it right at the start of the podcast.
There you go.
David, you're a legend. Thank you so much. And we're going to have to have you back as a topic. This was we could talk forever, so there's definitely much more to mind there. Have a great night. Thanks for your time. Our goal here at the Vet Vault is to have conversations, like the one you've just listened to, that will give you inspiration and fresh ideas on how to create a thriving and happy career and life as a vet. You'll know by now that our focus is on the life skills that we need to navigate this challenging and rewarding profession of ours. But there's something that I've realized over the last few years of exploring ways to increase enjoyment of the job. That is, that the vets who are confident in their skills and knowledge are, as a whole, more satisfied with their careers. Which makes sense. When you feel rusty or uncertain in your knowledge, it's very easy for those imposter feelings to sneak in. I don't know enough. Am I good enough? Conversely, we know that feelings of growth and mastery are some of the greatest predictors of a happy career, which is why we created the Vet Vault Clinical Podcasts. 3 highly practical episodes every week. Conversations, not lectures, with world-class specialists. Tips, updates, real insights, not textbook theory. Short enough to listen to on your drive to work, but with enough content to ensure that you'll be a little bit better at your job than you were before you listened. Join us on our journey to better by trying out our free 2-week trial at vvn.supercast.tech.